Welcome back everyone, I'm Nick. This channel is Swiftful Thinking, where we cover all things Swift and SwiftUI related. And in this very fun video, we're going to add core data to our app using Mvvm Architecture. Now, if you're not familiar with Mvvm, it stands for Model-View-ViewModel. And basically the idea is to separate the files in our app so that the code for the view, which is the UI, is separate from the code for the view model, which should handle all of the data. And in the last video in this series, I covered adding core data to your SwiftUI app using a fetch request. And while that is great, the problem with that is that the fetch request requires us to add all of the logic for core data into our view. And as you saw in the last video, it works, but it does start to add a lot of extra code into the view that could get confusing and not necessarily scalable. So in this video, we're going to look at an alternative approach by adding the core data into the view model, and I think this is something that's a little more practical for production applications. And if you've never used core data before, basically it is a local database on the iPhone that we can use to save information to. And this data will persist between sessions so that if we close the app and we open the app, the data still saves. All right, that's enough of me talking. Let's jump into Xcode, and I want to point out that I'm going to use the same project that I used for the rest of the course, excluding the last video. So I'm going to jump back into our normal Xcode project, and we're going to create a new file and get coding. Okay, welcome back everyone. I am back in our original Xcode project. So the last video we created a new project, but I'm actually back in our original project where we have all the files from this course. And for this video, I'm going to right-click the navigator and just create a new file. This will be a SwiftUI view. We're going to call it Core Data Bootcamp. Go ahead and click Create. Once you're inside, let's click Resume on the canvas. I'm going to leave the navigator open for a second because we are going to use it. Now, I do want to mention, if you're just joining, that in the last video in the series, I covered core data by using a fetch request. And I view the fetch request kind of as the beginner introductory way to get core data into your app, because it does make it really easy to get the data into the view. But in an actual production app, it's kind of not realistic to put all of that logic into the view. So instead of putting all of that logic into the view, we can extract it into a view model. And this drives us into Mvvm Architecture. So real quick, for anyone who's never done Mvvm before, and if you haven't, I recommend checking out the SwiftUI to-do list, which is a playlist on my YouTube channel where we actually make a beginner level Mvvm app. But real simple, there's three layers. We have the view, which is the UI. We have the model, which is sort of like a data point. And then we have the view model. And this, I would say, manages the data for a view. So behind the view is actually a view model that holds all of the data. And that data is going to be a bunch of models. All right, let's get started before I bore you guys, because I know I've covered all of this before. Let's create a class. We're going to call it Core Data View Model. Let's make it conform to observable object and go ahead and open the brackets. We're making it conform to observable objects so that we can observe it from our view. So let's initialize a new one in our view. We'll create an @state object var. We'll call it VM for view model, and we'll set it equal to a new core data view model. Open close parentheses. And let's start setting up our core data. So first we need to import core data at the top. So if you watched my last video, most of the logic right now is going to be very similar, because the template logic that Apple gave us is basically what we need to recreate here. So inside this, we're going to create an init, open close the parentheses, open the brackets. And the first thing we need to set up is our container. So we'll say let container of type ns persistent container. So now we need to set this up in our init. And if we don't, Xcode actually gives us an error, returning from initializer without initializing all stored properties. Basically means we're finishing our init without setting up the container. So let's call container equals a new ns persistent container, open the parentheses, and we're going to use the completion with the name. Now we haven't made the container yet, so let's just leave the name as a blank string for a second. And then after we get our container, we need to call container.loadPersistentStores. This just loads basically all the data from the container. Let's click enter on the handler. I'll make this a little bigger for a second. This is going to return NSPersistentStore description and an error. Let's call this description and let's call this error. And we're not going to really use either of these, but if there's an error, let's print it out so that we get a little indication that maybe there's a problem loading the stores. So we'll say if let error equals error, and we will print error loading core data. And then let's just do the backslash open close parentheses and print out the error. So if there's an error here, we can just print it out. And that's all the logic we need to load up core data. That's so simple and so short. It's awesome. But of course, we didn't set up this container yet, so let's do that now. And to do that, we're going to right-click the navigator, create a new file. So if we scroll down, there's a core data section. And in the core data section, we're going to click on the data model and click next. And then we can call it whatever we want, and this is going to be the name of our container. So I'm going to call this fruits container. Fruits container. Let's click create. And you can see here that the fruits container, it says fruits container over here on the left. And then we're in this container, and all we need to do here is add our data model. So basically it's going to be one entity. So we're going to add an entity. And we can name the entity. We're going to name this fruit entity and click enter. You don't need to include the word entity at the end, but I like to, just so that we know this is a core data entity. And this model, we can give it a bunch of attributes, just like we do any other model in our app. And we're going to give it one very simple attribute. So let's press add item. We're going to say name, and we're going to set the name to be a string. Now again, if you wanted to save a bunch of data for one entity, so if a fruit had some other attributes, you could add them here by pressing the plus, setting up all of the types. And as I mentioned in the last video, in core data, I would definitely try to stick to saving the types that you see here. So dates, booleans, strings, floats, doubles. You'll notice here that it does not say images because you cannot save an image or an audio file or a video file directly to core data. Now you could convert an image into binary data and then save it into core data, but that's not necessarily the recommended approach, so I don't want to tell you guys to do that. I'm going to cover saving images in a future video in this course, but I would recommend trying to stick to the types that you do see here. I'm just going to keep the name with a string, so for this attribute I'm just going to remove it with the minus sign here. So a fruit entity, and our fruit entity only has a name and it's a string. So now that we have this, let's just jump back into the core data bootcamp. We have our NSPersistence container, and the name, we can see it right here, is the fruits container. So if you create a different data model, the name would be right here, .exe data model. So let's say fruits container. Make sure this is exactly as it is here, word for word, and it might even be case sensitive, so just make sure that you have this string correct. And right now, if we don't get an error, let's just say else, and let's print successfully loaded core data. So with this right now, we should be able to figure out if we at least set up core data correctly or not. So let's take the core data bootcamp. Let's go into the app.swift file. Let's make this core data bootcamp the first view in our app, and let's run it on a simulator to see what prints out. All right, I loaded my screen and I got the printout to the console, successfully loaded core data. So if you're following along and you got this error loading core data, chances are you spelled the name wrong here. This NSPersistence container name needs to match the container exactly. So now that we got this container set up, we can actually create a fetch request to get the data from the container. So underneath this init, and I'll zoom out here because I see this is a little big. Let's create a func. We'll call it fetch fruits, open close parentheses, open the brackets. And in the last video, we used @fetchRequest. And now, because we're not in a view, we can't use that @fetchRequest property wrapper, but we can still create a fetch request. So we'll say let request equals ns fetch request, open the parentheses, and we're going to go down to the entity name. And the entity name needs to be exactly what we set up in our container. So if I open the container, my entity name is fruit entity. So make sure you're doing this exactly as well. Make sure it's exactly letter for letter, and it might even be case sensitive. I'm not sure. So mine is fruit entity. And we're going to get one more error that the generic parameter result type could not be inferred. Now, I haven't covered generics in my courses. I'm actually doing that later in this series. But for now, basically, this NHFetchRequest wants to know what kind of entity this entity is. What should we expect? So all we need to do is use the less than sign and the greater than sign. And inside these two signs, we will add the fruit entity. And my Xcode cannot find fruit entity in scope. I'm just going to X out of Xcode and reload it, and I think that will fix it. We'll find out in a second. So I literally just reloaded Xcode, and now it is green, so it found the fruit entity. Sometimes when you're adding these core data entities, the indexing just gets a little messed up. Just a reload Xcode and it should work. Now that we have our request, we can actually call it. So we'll say container, which is our container that we created up here. We will say .viewContext.fetch, and we're going to use the result that throws. And obviously the request of type NSFetchRequest is going to be our request that we set up. You saw that this call can throw, so we need to mark it with try. So we'll say do. We'll put all of our do statements in here, and then we'll say catch, let error, open the brackets. And in this catch, we'll just say print error fetching, and then I will do a backslash, open close parentheses, and then print out the error. And I kind of am doing this on purpose because Xcode gives us all of these really cool hints on how to write our code if we get lost, if we get stuck and something's not working. So now I did my do and catch statement, and I'm getting a error message here that the call can throw but is not marked with try. So all we need to do is add the word try in front of it. And I can even just click this fix to make it say try. And that's awesome. And even farther, now Xcode is telling us the result of this call, this line, is not being used. And that's because we haven't saved it anywhere. So where are we going to put it when we actually fetch this data? So at the top of our view model, let's create an @published var. Let's call it saved entities. And this will be of type, and it'll be an array of fruit entity. And we'll set it equal to a blank array for now. And we're just going to say saved entities equals try.container fetch. All right, so it's going to create the fetch request, try to fetch from the container, and then the result will be stored in saved entities. So after the load persistent stores, we will call fetch fruits. And I think it should work. I don't think we need to put it into the closure here. We'll find out in a second anyway. I'm going to delete this else because we already know that it's set up successfully. We have a function to fetch, but we haven't actually added any fruits. So let's create another func, add fruit, open close parentheses, open the brackets. When we add a fruit, we need the name, so we'll say text of type string. And just like in the last video, when you add something, you basically just need to create a fruit entity, give it some data, and then save. So we'll say let new fruit equals fruit entity, open the parentheses. We're going to use the context here, and we're going to enter it into the container.viewContext. It's the same container that we've been using this whole time. Now this is a blank fruit, and we need to add some data. So we'll say new fruit dot name, which is the variable we gave it, and we'll set it equal to the text that we're passing into this function. And then we very simply need to call save. So I'm going to create a function for the save because we're going to reuse it. We'll say func save data, open close parentheses, open the brackets. And this will be very simple. We'll call container.viewContext.save. And just like before, this call can throw and it's not marked with try. So we can add the do, open the brackets, put our calls inside. We'll mark it with try and we'll catch the errors and we'll say let error and we will print error saving. Backslash open close parentheses and we'll print out the error here. And if we do save this successfully, in the last video we used an @fetch request, which every time the data was saved it automatically updated on our view. But now our data on our view is actually going to be linked to this published variable. So every time we click save we need to re-update this published variable. And the simplest way to do it right now is to just call fetch fruits again, because when we call fetch fruits, it creates that fetch request and then it sets our saved entities equal to that whole request. So if we added a fruit and then called this again, the new fetch request would include that new fruit. So after we click save here, we'll just call fetch fruits. And then, of course, at the end of add fruit, we'll call save data. All right, that was a lot of code. Let's get the UI set up and then actually test this out. So I'm down in our view here. I'm going to open up the canvas quick. So let's create a navigation view. Inside, we'll add a VStack with some spacing of 20. I'm going to move faster here because if you've been following my courses, this should all be super familiar to you. Let's add a navigation title. Let's call it fruits. And the first thing in this VStack, let's add a text field. Open the parentheses. Let's use the string and binding. And the title, we're going to call it add fruit here, ... And the text, we need to bind it to something. So let's create an @state var. Text field text of type string equals a blank string. And we will bind it with the money sign text field text. Let's give this a .font of headline. Let's give it a .background of color. And let's make it a color literal. And I'm going to double click on this white. Click on the other, and we're going to use the mercury, which I think is a good color for text fields. Before the background, let's give it a .frame with a height of 55. Let's give it a corner radius of 10, and let's click try again and see what it looks like so far. Alright, so I got my fruits down here. Let's add maybe some padding .horizontal. And for now, I'm just going to add a spacer to push it up. Alright. Before the background color in the frame, I'm just going to add padding.leading to get the little indentation right here. Cool. And below that, let's add a button. We will add a action and label. And if you watched the last video, you could just copy the view from the last video. I'm just doing this again for people who are just joining. Let's make the button text font.headline. Let's give it a foreground color of white, and let's give it a background color. Let's do another color literal because I love color literals. Let's double click on the color literal. Let's use a new color. Maybe this strawberry. Let's go pink. I'm feeling like pink today. Let's give this a .frame of height of 55 and a frame with a max width of infinity. Alright, let's give it a corner radius of 10 to match the text field. And let's finally add that padding horizontal onto this button so that it matches. Beautiful. When we click this button, we want to take the text field text and then call add fruit, which we made before. So in the button, we're going to say vm.addFruit. Remember, VM is the view model that we set up here. and we will pass in the text field text. Now this text field text starts as a blank string, so I just want to make sure that it has at least one character. So we're going to say guard text field text dot is empty, else return. And we're going to say, when we're going to use the exclamation point to make sure that it is not empty. So we're going to say this is empty, and then this is not, so make sure it's not empty, and if it's not empty, we will add the text field text, and then we will set the text field text equal to a blank string so it reverts back. Okay, and then lastly, let's just add a list underneath this button. So I'm going to get rid of the spacer, I'm going to add a list, open the brackets, and then we're going to add a for each statement into this list. I'm going to open the brackets, and we're going to use this first completion here with just data. The data is going to be the VM, or view model, dot saved entities. This is the array that we made before. I'm going to click enter on the content, and this will just be for each entity. And I'm going to keep this simple. Let's just add a text. Let's add the entity.name, and it's optional. So if there is no entity name, let's do the double question marks, and we'll just say no name. All of our fruits have names, so we're not going to run into this error anyway. Alright, I think that's it for coding for right now. That was a lot of coding. I hope you're still with me. Let's click play on the simulator and see if it works. Alright, I'm loading the screen, and we have no fruits yet, but if I add a fruit, I'll say apple. Click the button, which we should make say save, and I will click the button, and it added our apple. Let's also change the list so it doesn't look this ugly. On the list, let's add a .list style, and we'll do plain list style, open close the parentheses. So this should look better as well. Let's rerun the app one more time. Alright, our button should say save. The list looks a little better. It says apple. I can add another orange. And you notice that the apple saved between sessions because it was saving to core data and then loading in core data. So if we kill this app and I reopen it, it still saves. Let's add some delete functions and update functions like we did in the last video. So when we delete, we can call on the for each, we'll call .delete on delete, and we can perform an action with an index set. So I'm going to just create that function up in our view model. So I'm going to go into the core data view model up here. Right below where we have add fruit, let's call func delete fruit. Let's pass in an index set of type index set. Open the brackets, and we'll do this logic in a second, but let's just call this from our view. So going back down, I'm going to get rid of this brackets here, and we're just going to call vm.deleteFruit. And it already has our index set here, but we don't even need that. So I can just delete this index set, and our super short code now says vm.deleteFruit. And just by adding that to our code, if I rerun it, this is how cool the for each in a list is. This on delete automatically adds the swipe to delete, which is so handy. But if we click it, obviously it doesn't delete yet because we haven't added that code. So back in our function to delete fruit, we need to find the entity that is at this index set. So an index set could have a bunch of indices, but we know when we're swiping this that it's really just one. So let's just say let index equals index set dot first, and this is optional, so we'll say guard let index equals index set first, else return. And then we'll say let entity equals saved entities, and we'll access the index. So this is our entity, and then we just need to call container.viewContext.delete, and we can pass in our entity. Now, just like when we added our fruit, and then we had to click save, and now we are deleting our fruit, and then we have to click save. So this is why we created our own function here, because we can just call save data again. And lastly, I want to create a function so that when we click on this word apple, we can update it. Now we're not going to add custom UI for updating, but really simply, when we click on apple, we're going to add an exclamation point to this word apple. So let's create a func update fruit. We're going to open close parentheses and open the brackets. Now we're going to call this from in our view, and I just want to point out that this on delete gave us an index set, and that's why we use an index set. But if I add an on tap gesture here onto the actual text, we can use the entity directly. So we don't even need to deal with the indexes. So when I create this update fruit, we're just going to pass in the entity directly, and it will be a fruit entity. So let's call that back in our tap gesture. We'll call vm.update fruit, and we'll pass in the entity. All right, let's finish up the code here. In our update fruit, all we need to do is take the entity and modify some of its variables. And we only have one variable, which is the name. So let's say let current name equals entity.name. And this is optional, as we know. So let's just do the double question marks, and let's just leave it a blank string if there is no name. We'll say let new name equals the current name plus an exclamation point. And then we'll set the entity.name equal to the new name. And just like we did when we delete and when we add, we need to then call save data. It's that simple. Let's click play to rerun our app. And I hope this works. We have the ability to add fruits, watermelon. We have the ability to delete fruits, and we can update fruits. When we click on them, it'll add the exclamation point. And if I close the app and reopen the app, it should now save in that state. All right, guys, so there's a lot of code today and a lot going on in this video, but what I really want to point out here with this MVVM method is that in our view, which is the Core Data Bootcamp view here, we don't have any logic that is dealing with downloading data, updating data, saving data. All we have is a reference to the view model right here. And when we go to call something to change the data, like adding a fruit, we call view model and then add fruit, and then all of the logic for adding a fruit is in that function. Just like when we call update fruit or delete fruit, all of that logic is in the view model. So our view here is dedicated to the actual UI. This is just dealing with the front end of the UI. And every time we need to actually access or change the data, that's all being done in the view model. So in our view model, we have all of this logic up here, which is, as you can see, is actually a lot of logic. And this is a pretty simple app. So when you have more complex data, this logic will get much, much longer. And that's why it's important to separate the different layers in your app. So in this core data view model, we have all of the logic for updating this data, downloading the data, saving the data, etc. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I know core data can definitely be confusing. A couple notes to just point out is the main thing you need to do with core data is set up your persistent container. And that persistent container is this file we set up here. And in here we can add our entity. We can give it a whole bunch of attributes. If we wanted to give it more attributes than just the name, we could have added that here. And then when you go to fetch, you just need to make sure that you have the correct entity name and of course the correct entity type. So as you can see, these calls to actually fetch from core data and to save to core data are relatively easy. They're relatively short and easy to use. You just need to know how to use them. So I hope this video helped someone out there because I know core data is a challenge. If it did and you're enjoying my content, definitely hit the subscribe button. I got a lot more videos to come. I'm excited. I hope you guys are excited. Thank you for watching. As always, I'm Nick. This is Swiftful Thinking, and I'll see you in the next video.